Hi, um, good evening, Leipzig. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share our experience with Soviet hippies. I hope it's somehow helpful. Because indeed, archive research as well as the clearance was probably the most challenging parts of filmmaking of this project. And for me, um, the focus or the most intriguing part of the whole story of the Soviet hippies has always been the history of it. I was interested in how the hippie movement emerged and how it became a subculture of its own and how this subculture was really like and what they were doing. But unfortunately, when we started going into the filmmaking phase, it came out that there's barely no archive. And that's simply because in the Soviet official discourse, the hippies just didn't exist. Especially after the moment when the movement was politicized, it was around 1970, 1971, especially after the 1st of June arrest in Moscow, that is also an episode in the film. There was no trace in the public discourse about the hippies. So when I was going into the Estonian film archive or other public archives, there was barely anything after late 60s. So, for example, we found this how the guys in Tallinn were destroying phone booths, and that was from 1966. It was still the moment when the movement was sort of not politicized. The hippies were not treated as the social parasite that is dangerous for the societal well-being. Of course, I was looking into KGB archives because I was mostly interested in the power relations between the authorities and the hippies. But KGB archives as such in Russia, as we all know, it just doesn't exist. There's no door where you can knock on and ask permission for the research. However, I believe there are huge treasures for filmmakers like us. So I was looking into the KGB archives in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and there was no visual trace. I think it's also partly because they took most of the archives or most of the most sensitive archives to Moscow in the late of 80s when the Soviet Union collapsed. While we were already editing the project, we had a rough cut of about 2 hours, and that was the time when we were thinking that the film is gonna be more observational, more about the old-grown hippies as they are today and how they're gonna take the journey from Tallinn to Moscow on a little hippie bus. And I remember when my editor and the producer were trying to convince me that the characters are more important than the history, and I was still that, yes, but I'm not entirely sure. And so I was still going around and asking everybody if they know anybody who has some archives. Yes, we had lots of photos. We had already produced an exhibition for Estonian National Museum about our initial research in Estonia. So we had lots of photos, but barely no footage. And everywhere I was going and I asked, they said that the camera was the first thing that the KGB guys were taking away from the hippies. So basically they were leaving me very little hope. But also what was happening during the filmmaking, and it was about 6 years, was the big social media boom. So suddenly the hippies moved to Facebook, and also in the Russian version of Facebook, Vkontakte, and that opened up new opportunities for me to reach really big part of the community. So I was writing to many people, asking if they know anybody who has archives. Also, I was posting in Russian in some closed hippie communities. And after a while, some miracles started to appear. For example, one day I received a message in Facebook saying that we have a box full of film rolls, just why don't you come to Moscow? We cannot mail it, it's too sacred for us, but if you're gonna come around, we can give it to you. So I took the train to Moscow, met somebody at the kitchen table, drank tea, and voila, there was a full box full of film footage. So it was actually one hippie lady who herself had gathered among her friends these film rolls, because she knew that these are valuable, and she also had some ideas of making the movies, but then at some point for political reasons she had to escape Russia, and she left the box with his friend. And when she heard about me and the project, and I had already been around for a few years, so many people knew me and knew what were my intentions or how I was as a person. So I think all this like played a lot, so that the community was opening up and trusting me of giving me archives, because very often it was that nobody was really sending any archive until I to meet them personally in Petersburg or Moscow or in Ukraine, and then we had a contact, and then sometime later they were transferring some scanned footage for us. So that's why I always say that this film is a real collaborative process, not only between our creative team, but also between the community, who are really not only sharing their stories but also sharing their archives. But of course, that kind of archive use set a real challenge also for the clearance, because often enough it was not clear who was really the one who was taking the photo, or who was really the one who was holding the camera at that time. And camera was still very rare among the hippies, and all the footage that we found, most of it is from late 70s, when the Super 8 cameras were already going around, but still rare, and also often enough the authorities were taking away all the footage and the camera from the hippies. The earliest home footage we got is from 1972, and it was this one guy in Estonia only one guy in Estonia, who was going around at film festivals and concerts and filming with his Super 8 camera. And of course I was very, very happy to know him, and that he was giving us the chance to use his archives. So when I found all these archives, and of course the editor saw that they were amazing, and we both kind of fell in love with this archive, and I was also very happy, so that the film really took the turn towards this more like a pop culture history story that I initially would want to tell, and we were really going around with it playfully, and not being afraid of photos as well, but rather taking the photos as something to challenge our creativity to do something more interesting with the photos. So we used all this flashy stuff, and I think the nature of the topic, Soviet hippies, psychedelia, which is exuberance of sensory input. So I think all that allowed us for this kind of mixed media approach to combine interviews, observational, and photos and footage, and also animations, and both from the Soviet area and also newly made animations. But also the newly made animations, we were still tying it to the archives, so we used some photo collage techniques also to again take the most of the amazing archive that we managed to find throughout these years. So I'll stop here, and I wish you great days at DOKLeipzig, and please enjoy the film. Thank you.